Have you ever wondered what could make an entire German regiment refuse to advance, even under direct orders from their commanders? What kind of warrior could turn hardened SS officers into trembling men who would rather face court-martial than step foot into a particular sector of the front lines? Before we dive into this incredible story that has been buried in classified documents for decades, I need your help. First, comment below telling me where you're watching from, and then hit that subscribe button. This channel survives only because of your support, and we're committed to bringing you these secret stories that the mainstream media refuses to tell. Now, let's uncover the truth. The winter of 1944 descended upon the Ardennes forest like a frozen curtain of death. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets, covering the blood-soaked earth where thousands of American soldiers fought desperately against the German counteroffensive that would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. But in a remote sector of the Belgian forest, something else was happening. Something that would never appear in official history books. Something that German survivors would speak of only in whispers, if they spoke of it at all. His name was Joseph Two Hawks, though the Germans would come to call him Der Schatten, the Shadow. A full-blooded Lakota warrior from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, Joseph stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, with shoulders broad as an oak beam and eyes that seemed to pierce through the perpetual fog of war. He had enlisted in the spring of 1942, 3 months after his 21st birthday, when recruiters came through the reservation looking for men who could navigate terrain that would break ordinary soldiers. What the Army didn't tell the German High Command was that they had unknowingly recruited something far more dangerous than another infantryman. They had recruited a man raised in the old ways, taught by his grandfather, a survivor of Wounded Knee, how to move through the wilderness like smoke, how to read signs in broken twigs and disturbed earth that would be invisible to white eyes, how to strike from darkness and vanish before the enemy could comprehend what had happened. The first incident occurred on December 18, 1944, 3 days after the German offensive began. A Wehrmacht patrol, 12 men strong, disappeared without a single shot being fired. The patrol leader, Oberfeldwebel Hans Kruger, was found the following morning tied to a tree at the edge of the German lines. He was alive, but his mind had shattered like glass. When his commanding officer demanded to know what happened to his men, Kruger could only repeat the same phrase over and over in a voice barely above a whisper. Der Indianer kommt in der Nacht. Der Indianer kommt in der Nacht. The Indian comes in the night. His 11 companions were never found. Not their bodies, not their weapons, not even their dog tags. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. German intelligence officers examined the area where they had last been seen. What they discovered defied their understanding of modern warfare. There were no shell craters, no bullet casings, no signs of conventional combat. Instead, they found something that made even experienced officers uncomfortable. 11 sets of boot prints, all leading in the same direction, all stopping abruptly at the exact same point, as if the men had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. But there was something else, something that would become the signature calling card of Der Schatten. At the base of an ancient oak tree, carved with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the wood, was a symbol that none of the German intelligence officers could identify. It looked like a bird in flight, or perhaps a spirit rising, rendered in a style that predated European contact with the Americas by centuries. I saw him once, just for a moment, wrote Private First Class Michael Donovan of the 101st Airborne Division in a letter to his sister that would not be delivered until 1946, long after the war had ended. We were dug in near Bastogne, scared out of our minds, expecting a German assault any minute. It was maybe 0200 hours, so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Then I saw movement in the trees. At first, I thought it was one of theirs, and I nearly fired. But something stopped me. He moved different than any soldier I'd ever seen. No sound, not even a whisper. He flowed between the trees like he was part of them. Then he looked right at me, and I swear to God, Sarah, I've never seen eyes like that. They weren't angry or scared. They were just certain, like he knew exactly how the next hour was going to unfold, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do to change it. Then he was gone. Just gone. 10 minutes later, we heard the screaming from the German side. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Complete silence. The Germans never attacked that night. E.T. The pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency, as the Battle of the Bulge ground forward through the frozen hell of the Ardennes. German units would report encounters with what they initially believed was a small American Special Forces team. But the reports began to contradict themselves in ways that suggested something beyond conventional military operations. A panzer commander reported that his tank column had been stalked through the forest for 6 hours by at least 15 to 20 American commandos who moved through the trees without ever touching the ground. His second-in-command insisted there was only one man. A Wehrmacht captain swore his company had been ambushed by a force using weapons unlike anything in the Allied arsenal, primitive but devastatingly effective. When pressed for details, he described arrows, tomahawks, and something he called rope traps that appeared from nowhere. The German High Command initially dismissed these reports as the products of exhausted, frostbitten men seeing phantoms in the endless white landscape. But then the bodies started appearing. On December 22nd, a German supply convoy was found decimated 15 miles behind the front lines. All 17 soldiers were dead, arranged in a perfect circle around their burning vehicles. Each man had been killed differently, with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of human anatomy and an almost surgical understanding of where to strike for maximum effect. But what disturbed the investigating officers most was the complete absence of panic in the scene. The men's weapons were still holstered. Their supplies were untouched. It was as if they had been lined up and executed one by one, and not one had attempted to flee or fight back. At the center of the circle was another carving, larger and more elaborate than the others. This time, German intelligence brought in Professor Klaus Adenauer, an anthropologist from the University of Berlin who had studied indigenous American cultures before the war. His report, classified and buried in Wehrmacht archives, made for disturbing reading. "The symbol is Lakota in origin," he wrote. "It represents Iktomi, the spider trickster spirit, but rendered in a way I have never encountered in academic literature. The execution suggests not merely cultural knowledge, but active practice of traditions that predate the American westward expansion. Most concerning is the precision of the carving itself. This was not hastily scratched into the earth. This was a deliberate message, executed with time and care. The implications are clear. Whoever is responsible for these incidents is not operating under the constraints of fear or urgency. They are hunting." By Christmas Eve, 1944, entire German companies were refusing to patrol certain sectors of the forest. Commanders found themselves unable to maintain discipline as stories spread through the ranks like wildfire. The tales grew more elaborate with each telling. Der Schatten could walk through walls. He could disappear into mist. He could kill a man from 100 yards away without making a sound. He never slept. He never ate. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost made flesh, an ancient spirit awakened by the blood soaked into the frozen ground. But Joseph Two Hawks was very much flesh and blood. He ate when he could, slept in frozen foxholes when exhaustion became unbearable, and felt the same fear that gripped every soldier on that God-forsaken battlefield. The difference was what he did with that fear. My grandfather told me something when I was 8 years old. Joseph later wrote in a journal that would remain hidden until his daughter donated it to the Smithsonian in 2007. He said that fear is a gift from the spirits. It sharpens your senses, quickens your blood, opens your mind to possibilities you would otherwise miss. A warrior does not fight against fear. He rides it like a horse, lets it carry him to places his enemies cannot follow, because they are too busy running from the very thing that makes them strong. The Americans knew about Joseph, of course. His commanding officer, Captain Robert Harrison from Atlanta, Georgia, had initially tried to rein in what he called irregular activities not befitting a United States soldier. But after Joseph single-handedly extracted a platoon of pinned-down paratroopers from a German encirclement, Harrison's protests died in his throat. The official report stated that an unidentified force created a diversion, allowing for tactical withdrawal. Everyone in the company knew what that diversion had been. He'd disappear for days at a time, recalled Sergeant William Chen, a Nisei soldier from California who served in Joseph's unit. Captain would ask where Two Hawks went, and we'd just shrug. But you could always tell when he was out there working because the Germans would get quiet. Not regular quiet. Wrong quiet. Like they were holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. And it always did. The truth was that Joseph operated on a level that made conventional military thinking obsolete. He didn't see the battlefield as a grid of coordinates and strategic positions. He saw it as his grandfather had taught him to see the Black Hills, as a living entity with its own rhythms and spirits, its own hidden trails and sacred spaces. While American and German forces battered each other in frontal assaults that gained yards at the cost of hundreds of lives, Joseph moved through the spaces between, guided by instincts honed over generations of his people. He studied the German soldiers with the same attention his grandfather had studied deer. He learned their patterns, their habits, their fears. He discovered that Wehrmacht units rotated sentries every 2 hours, creating a 60-second window of confusion during the change. He noticed that panzer crews always gathered for coffee at 0600 hours, their attention focused inward rather than on the surrounding forest. He realized that German officers were trained to expect threats from predictable directions, along roads and clearings, leaving the dense underbrush as a blind spot in their tactical awareness. And he exploited every weakness with ruthless efficiency. On December 28, 1944, a German SS officer named Sturmbannführer Otto Brandt made the mistake of boasting to his superiors that he would personally hunt down and kill Der Schatten. Brandt was a veteran of the Eastern Front, decorated for his actions during the siege of Stalingrad, known throughout his regiment as a man who feared nothing. He assembled a hunting party of 20 of his best men, all experienced killers who had survived the brutal warfare of the Russian campaign. They entered the forest at dawn. By nightfall, Brandt returned alone, his uniform torn, his face gray as ash. He submitted his resignation from the SS immediately and refused to speak of what had happened. His superiors, enraged by what they saw as cowardice, threw him in the stockade. 3 days later, he hung himself using strips of his own uniform. He left no note, but scratched into the wall of his cell were 2 words, repeated over and over until his fingers bled. Ist kein Mann. He is not a man. The 20 soldiers who had accompanied Brandt were found 6 weeks later when American forces advanced through that sector. They were buried in a mass grave carefully arranged with their hands folded across their chests, their weapons placed respectfully beside them. Each man bore a single wound, precise and fatal. At the head of the grave was a wooden marker carved with extraordinary skill, bearing each man's name, rank, and date of death. At the bottom was a message in German, carved in the same hand. Sie starben mit Ehre. Mögen ihre Geister Frieden finden. They died with honor. May their spirits find peace. This discovery would haunt Allied intelligence for years after the war ended. It suggested something that made military analysts deeply uncomfortable. Joseph Two Hawks was not simply killing Germans. He was conducting his own private war according to rules that predated the Geneva Convention by centuries. Rules that recognized courage even in an enemy. Rules that demanded respect for the dead, regardless of which side they had fought for. But respect for the dead did not mean mercy for the living. January brought no relief to the frozen hell of the Ardennes, only deeper cold and darker secrets. As Allied forces began pushing back against the German offensive, they started uncovering evidence of something that had been happening parallel to the conventional war, something that existed in the shadows between official reports and sanitized history. What they discovered would lead to one of the most classified investigations in United States military history. Lieutenant Colonel James McCarthy of the Army's Criminal Investigation Division arrived in Belgium on January 15, 1945. With orders to investigate what his superiors termed irregular combat activities and potential violations of the laws of war. His team of 6 investigators expected to find evidence of rogue American soldiers committing atrocities against German prisoners. What they found instead would challenge everything they thought they understood about warfare. We interviewed over 200 soldiers, both American and German prisoners, McCarthy wrote in his final report, a document that would remain sealed until 1998. The consistency of their accounts, despite their inability to communicate with each other and their vastly different perspectives, was remarkable. They were describing the same individual, the same methods, the same inexplicable occurrences. But more disturbing was what we found in the field itself. The physical evidence suggested a level of tactical sophistication and psychological warfare that should not have been possible for a single operator working alone. McCarthy's team mapped out over 40 incidents attributed to Der Schatten across a 30-mile stretch of the Ardennes. The pattern that emerged defied conventional military logic. Joseph Two Hawks had somehow managed to be in multiple locations simultaneously, covering distances that should have required mechanized transport, operating with perfect knowledge of German movements despite having no access to intelligence reports or radio communication. It was as if he could sense where the enemy would be before they knew themselves. But there was something else in the evidence that McCarthy's team struggled to explain. In 12 separate locations, they found what appeared to be ceremonial sites. Circles of stones arranged in specific patterns, small offerings of tobacco and cornmeal, feathers tied to branches with leather cord. At each site, the surrounding area showed signs of German military activity that had ceased abruptly and never resumed. It was as if entire units had encountered these places and decided, without orders or explanation, to route around them completely. I spoke with a German Hauptmann who had been captured near Bastogne. McCarthy's report continued. When I showed him photographs of these sites, he became visibly agitated. He insisted that his men had standing orders never to approach such locations, orders that had come from division command. When I pressed him on the origin of these orders, he claimed they had been issued after a reconnaissance team disappeared near one of the stone circles. The team was found 3 days later, alive but catatonic, arranged in a perfect spiral pattern around the stones. Not one of them ever spoke again. The Hauptmann believed these sites were cursed. that they were somehow connected to Der Schatten, that approaching them would result in madness or death. The investigation took a darker turn when McCarthy's team began cross-referencing reports with German intelligence documents captured during the advance. They discovered that the Wehrmacht had dedicated an entire intelligence unit to tracking and analyzing Der Schatten's activities. The officer in charge, Major Karl Zimmermann, had compiled a file that ran to over 300 pages, filled with witness statements, tactical analyses, and increasingly desperate recommendations. Zimmermann's final entry, dated January 3, 1945, was found unfinished on his desk when American forces captured his headquarters. He had been in the process of writing a recommendation that the entire Ardennes sector be abandoned when something interrupted him. His aide reported that Zimmermann had received a package that afternoon, delivered by courier from the front lines. Inside was a single eagle feather and a note written in perfect German. Die Geister der Toten fordern Gerechtigkeit. Verlasse diesen heiligen Boden oder schließe dich ihnen an. The spirits of the dead demand justice. Leave this sacred ground or join them. Zimmermann had immediately ordered his staff to evacuate the headquarters. He stayed behind alone to burn his files. When American forces arrived 6 hours later, they found him sitting at his desk, his service pistol in his hand, staring at the eagle feather with an expression that witnesses described as profound existential terror. He surrendered without resistance, the only time in his military career he had failed to destroy classified documents before capture. When interrogated, he would only repeat that some enemies could not be defeated with bullets and steel, that there were powers in the world that modern warfare had no answer for. But the most disturbing discovery came when McCarthy's team interviewed Joseph Two Hawks himself. They found him at a field hospital near Liège, recovering from frostbite and exhaustion. He had walked out of the forest on January 10th, 3 days after the German withdrawal from the Ardennes began, and collapsed at an American checkpoint. He had been operating behind enemy lines for 26 consecutive days, without resupply, without communication, without orders. The interview was supposed to last 1 hour, wrote Captain Sandra Morrison, the team's psychological officer. It lasted 7 minutes. Two Hawks answered every question with absolute precision, provided exact dates and locations for his activities, and showed no signs of remorse, trauma, or excitement. His affect was completely flat, as if he were describing routine training exercises rather than weeks of solitary combat operations that had terrorized an entire German army group. But what ended the interview was when Colonel McCarthy asked him how he had managed to cover so much ground, to be in so many places, to know where the Germans would be. Two Hawks looked at him with those unsettling eyes and said, "I wasn't alone. My grandfather's grandfather was with me, and his grandfather before him, and all the warriors who walked this earth before the white man came and forgot how to listen to the land." McCarthy tried to probe further, but Two Hawks simply stood up, said the interview was over, and walked out. We didn't try to stop him. Joseph was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions in the Ardennes, though the citation was deliberately vague about the specific nature of his service. The ceremony was private, attended only by his immediate commanding officers. No photographs were taken. No press was invited. The army wanted to honor his courage, while simultaneously burying the reality of what he had done, how he had done it, and what it meant for their understanding of modern warfare. But the story didn't end with Germany's surrender in May of 1945. Joseph returned to Pine Ridge Reservation in September of that year, and that's when the truly inexplicable events began. Veterans from his unit started reporting strange occurrences. They would wake in the middle of the night, convinced that Joseph was in their room, standing in the corner, watching. but when they turned on the lights, no one was there. Others reported seeing him in crowds, in cities hundreds of miles from South Dakota, only to discover later that he had never left the reservation. German veterans living in displaced persons camps throughout Europe reported similar experiences, claiming that Der Schatten was hunting them still, that the war had not ended for him. The Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, opened a file on Joseph in October of 1945. The file, declassified in 2012, reveals that the government was concerned about what they termed potential security risks stemming from unorthodox combat techniques and possible psychological manipulation of enemy forces. They wanted to understand his methods, to see if they could be systematized, weaponized, and deployed against the Soviet Union in what everyone knew would be the next great conflict. They sent Agent Thomas Whitmore, a veteran investigator with experience in Native American affairs, to interview Joseph at Pine Ridge. Whitmore's report makes for unsettling reading. Subject was cooperative but evasive, Whitmore wrote. When questioned about his techniques in the Ardennes, he stated that he had simply done what his ancestors had always done: protected his people from invaders. When I pointed out that the Germans were not invading America, he laughed and said, "I didn't understand." He said that every war is the same war, fought over and over since the beginning of time. He said the land remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it, and those who know how to listen can hear the voices of all who died in battle, across all ages. He then asked me if I had ever wondered why certain places feel wrong, why some battlefields remain haunted long after the dead are buried. He suggested that perhaps the reason European powers could never fully subjugate the Americas was because the land itself rejected them, because the spirits of the indigenous peoples who had lived here for 10,000 years before Columbus would never allow it. Whitmore recommended that the investigation be closed. His reasoning was pragmatic. Any attempt to systematize or replicate subjects' methods would require a fundamental restructuring of military training that acknowledges spiritual and ancestral components of warfare. This would be incompatible with existing doctrine and potentially destabilizing to unit cohesion. Furthermore, Subject appears to have no interest in sharing his knowledge with military authorities. He views his actions during the war as a personal spiritual obligation rather than service to the United States government. He is not a security threat, but he is also not an asset we can exploit. But the file did not close. It continued to grow over the decades, fed by a stream of reports that defied explanation. In 1953, a German businessman named Friedrich Kohler died of a heart attack in Hamburg. His widow found a journal among his possessions that detailed his service as a Wehrmacht officer in the Ardennes. The final entry, written 2 days before his death, described a recurring dream he'd had every night since 1944. In the dream, he stood in a forest filled with stone circles and eagle feathers, and a tall figure with eyes like winter storms told him that he had been marked, that he would never know peace until he made amends for the blood he had shed. Kohler had apparently spent the last 8 years of his life anonymously donating money to Native American causes, trying to buy his way out of a curse that existed only in his own mind. Or did it? In 1968, during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, a Marine Corps sniper reported encountering an older Native American man deep in the jungle near Khe Sanh. The man was not in uniform, carried no modern weapons, and seemed completely unbothered by the combat raging around him. When the sniper asked what he was doing there, the man replied that he was teaching, that every generation needed warriors who understood the old ways. Then he vanished into the jungle. The sniper later identified the man from photographs as Joseph II Hawks, though military records showed Joseph was at that time living on Pine Ridge Reservation and had not left South Dakota in over 2 years. By 1970, the OSS file had been transferred to the CIA and then to a special projects division that dealt with what they called anomalous phenomena of military significance. The file was thick with reports from across the globe, all following the same pattern. Soldiers in combat zones reporting encounters with a Native American warrior who appeared from nowhere, offered cryptic advice or warnings, and disappeared without explanation. Sometimes the description matched Joseph Two Hawks. Sometimes it matched no one in particular, as if the figure was a template that different observers filled in with their own expectations. Joseph himself remained on Pine Ridge, living a quiet life. He married a woman named Mary Blackhorse in 1949, raised 3 children, worked as a tracker for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and became an elder respected throughout the Lakota community. He rarely spoke of the war, and when he did, it was only to other veterans who could understand. But there were moments when the mask slipped, when something ancient and terrible flickered behind his weathered features. In 1976, during the occupation of Wounded Knee by the American Indian Movement, federal agents surrounded the reservation. Joseph walked out to meet them alone, unarmed. He stood in the road for 3 hours without moving, without speaking, just watching. The agents reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were being measured and found wanting. One agent later described it as standing before a judge who could see not just your actions, but your soul. The standoff ended without violence, and several of the agents involved requested transfers immediately afterward. One left law enforcement entirely and became a minister, claiming he had seen something in Joseph's eyes that convinced him of the reality of spiritual warfare. The last official entry in Joseph's government file was dated March 12, 1994. Joseph had died peacefully in his sleep at age 73, surrounded by his family. The attending physician noted no unusual circumstances. But that same night, in a veterans' hospital in Munich, Germany, 3 former Wehrmacht officers who had served in the Ardennes died simultaneously, all from heart attacks, all at exactly 0300 hours Central European time. Their deaths would have been unremarkable, except for one detail. Each man was found clutching a small stone carved with a symbol that German intelligence had documented 50 years earlier in the forests of Belgium. A symbol that looked like a bird in flight, or perhaps a spirit rising. The question that has haunted military historians ever since is deceptively simple. Was Joseph Two Hawks a man who became a legend, or was he something else entirely? Was he a skilled soldier who exploited superstition and fear to devastating effect, or was he a channel for something older, something that existed before nations and armies, something that viewed the Second World War as just another chapter in an eternal conflict between invaders and defenders of sacred ground? The evidence suggests both answers might be true simultaneously. Modern Special Forces operators study the Battle of the Bulge extensively, but they never study Der Schatten. His tactics cannot be taught in any manual because they required something that cannot be trained. A connection to the land so deep that you become part of it. A heritage so ancient that your ancestors walk beside you in battle. A faith so absolute that your enemy's bullets seem to bend around you, not because of luck, but because the spirits have decided you are under their protection. There are researchers who continue to investigate the Joseph Two Hawks phenomenon. They interview aging veterans, sift through declassified documents, visit the sites where Der Schatten left his mark. What they find is consistent. Joseph operated according to principles that modern military science cannot accommodate, that he achieved results that should have been impossible for a lone operator, that his psychological impact on German forces far exceeded what any single soldier should have been able to accomplish. And then there are the rumors that refuse to die. Rumors that Joseph Two Hawks still walks the earth, appearing wherever indigenous peoples face violence and oppression. Rumors that he was seen at Standing Rock in 2016, at Wounded Knee on every anniversary of the massacre. In the Amazon rainforest, protecting uncontacted tribes from loggers. Rumors that Der Schatten is not a person, but a role, passed down through generations of warriors, a spiritual office that someone must always fill. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows between myth and history, between what we can prove and what we choose to believe. What we know for certain is this. In the winter of 1944, in the frozen forests of Belgium, a Lakota warrior from South Dakota became a ghost that haunted the German army. He killed efficiently, fought honorably according to his own code, and returned home to live a quiet life. The official record ends there, but every year on December 18th, the anniversary of that first patrol that disappeared without a trace, veterans gather at the Ardennes American Cemetery in Belgium. They stand in section 43, row 12, where a simple stone marker bears no name, only a date and a symbol, a bird in flight, a spirit rising, and they speak of the warrior who reminded the world that there are powers older than tanks and bombers, older than empires and ideologies, powers that sleep in the bones of the earth until the blood of the innocent cries out for justice. They speak of the debt every soldier owes to those who taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, that honor is not awarded by governments, but earned through integrity when no one is watching, that the truest warriors fight not for conquest, but for protection, not for glory, but for their people. And they speak of the question that haunts every person who has ever stood on a battlefield and wondered if they would have the strength to do what must be done. When the darkness closes in, when hope seems lost, when the enemy is overwhelming, will you find within yourself the courage of your ancestors? Will you become more than human, more than soldier, more than warrior? Will you become myth? Joseph Two Hawks answered that question in the Ardennes forest. His answer echoes still in the wind that moves through the pines, in the stones that mark forgotten graves, in the hearts of every person who refuses to surrender in the face of impossible odds. In times of darkness, we must remember that we are never truly alone. We carry within us the strength of all who came before, the wisdom of ancestors who faced their own impossible battles and prevailed. Whether you call it faith, heritage, or simply the human spirit, it is the same force that allowed one Lakota warrior to hold back an army. But remember this, with great power comes great responsibility. Joseph Two Hawks could have been a monster. He had the skills, the opportunity, the justification. Instead, he chose to be a guardian, to fight with honor even when honor seemed like a luxury his enemies did not deserve. He proved that you can be fierce without being cruel, that you can be deadly without being evil, that you can wage war without losing your humanity. In a world that often seems consumed by darkness, where evil appears to triumph and good people suffer, we must hold fast to our faith. Not the faith of institutions or dogma, but the deep faith that guided Joseph's hand when he faced impossible odds, the faith that there is something greater than ourselves, something worth fighting for, something worth protecting even at the cost of our own comfort and safety. That faith has a name. For Joseph, it was the spirits of his ancestors, the wisdom of the old ways, the sacred duty passed down through generations. For others, it might be different words, different traditions, different understandings, but the truth at the heart remains the same. There is a light in the darkness. There is hope in despair. There is strength when we feel weak. We need only to open our hearts to receive it. to surrender our pride and our fear, to acknowledge that we are part of something infinitely larger than ourselves. In the Christian tradition, that light has a name: Jesus Christ, the one who walked among us, who taught us to love even our enemies, who showed us that true strength lies not in domination, but in service, not in vengeance, but in forgiveness, not in the power to destroy, but in the courage to build. God's love surrounds us, even in the darkest valleys, even in the frozen forests where death waits behind every tree. We need only to call upon His name, to surrender our burdens to Him, to trust that He will guide us through whatever trials we face. The story of Der Schatten is ultimately a story about faith. Faith in something greater than ourselves. Faith that we can face impossible odds and prevail. Faith that our actions matter even when we cannot see the larger pattern they are part of. Whether you find that faith in the teachings of Christ, in the wisdom of your ancestors, in the love of family and community, or in the quiet voice within that tells you to stand up when everything around you says to stay down, that faith is the most powerful weapon any warrior can carry. As you go forward from this moment, carrying this story with you, ask yourself, what will you do when your moment comes? When the darkness closes in, when the enemy seems overwhelming, when every rational voice tells you to give up? Will you find within yourself the strength to become your own version of Der Schatten, not as a killer, but as a protector, not as a destroyer, but as a guardian? The choice is yours. The power is within you. The ancestors are watching, and God is waiting for you to step forward into your destiny. May you walk in light, even through the darkest valleys. May you find courage when fear threatens to consume you. May you discover that you are never alone, that you carry within you the strength of all who came before, and the hope of all who will come after. And may you always remember that the greatest battles are not fought with weapons of steel, but with faith, with love, and with the unshakable conviction that there is something worth fighting for, something worth protecting, something worth becoming. This is the legacy of Joseph Two Hawks. This is the truth Der Schatten left carved in stone and whispered on the wind. This is the secret that governments classified, that historians overlooked, that the world forgot until now. Remember it, share it, live it, and when the darkness comes, do not be afraid. The warriors are still walking, the spirits are still watching, and the light still shines, waiting for you to carry it forward into whatever battles lie ahead.